The bells of St. Aldhelm rang twice that morning, once for the hour and once for the wedding, and Eleanor Vane stood at the back of the churchyard in a grey travelling cloak no one thought to recognize. Inside, the man who had been her husband was marrying another woman. The doors had been left open against the heat, and through them came the vicar's measured voice and the rustle of silk, and the particular hush that falls over a congregation when it believes it is witnessing something it will repeat at dinner for a year. Eleanor did not go in. She had not been invited, and she had not come to be seen. She had come because a letter folded 3 times in her reticule said that by law she had every reason to. A woman near the lich gate, fanning herself in lavender muslin, leaned to her companion and said, "The thing the whole county had decided. Poor creature, the one before. Sent off to die quietly in the north, and now forgotten before the cake is cut," her companion murmured agreement. Eleanor kept her face toward the church. She had learned, over 3 years of being spoken of as though she were already a headstone, that the safest expression was none at all. Yet her gloved hand closed once around the strap of the reticule, and beneath the wool of the cloak, her heart went on with the steady, stubborn work of being alive. She was 24 years old, and she was not dead. That was the first fact, and the county had got it wrong. The second fact was the one folded in her reticule, and she meant to deliver it before the day was out. If you have ever stood outside a door that was once your own and listened to your own life being given away, stay with this story to its end. What the county believed that morning, and what was true, had drifted very far apart, and the distance between them is where this whole story lives. 3 years earlier she had married Captain Hugh Marlowe in this same church, in a wedding far smaller than the one happening now, because his uncle, the old Lord Ashcombe, had not yet died, and Hugh had been only a soldier with good manners and a modest commission. She had loved him in the plain way of a young woman who has not yet been taught caution. He had loved her, she believed, in the way of a man who finds a thing pleasant until something more advantageous is offered. Then the old lord died without a son. The title and the estate of Renfield came down the line to Hugh, and a soldier's wife from a clergyman's family was no longer the wife the new Lord Ashcombe wished to be seen beside. He had not divorced her. Divorce was ruinous, slow and public, and Hugh hated all 3 of those things more than he hated her. Instead, he had done something quieter. He had sent her north to a damp house on the edge of the moors that belonged to a distant cousin, with an allowance small enough to be a punishment and a story attached that the new Lady Ashcombe was consumptive, fragile, kept from society for her health, unlikely to last the winter. The story had been repeated so often and so kindly that it had become true in every drawing-room in the county. Everyone knew poor Lady Ashcombe was dying in the north. It was a settled fact. It saved a great deal of awkwardness. What Hugh had not troubled to learn, because he had stopped troubling to learn anything about her the moment she ceased to be useful, was that the cousin in the north was a solicitor's widow with a sharp mind and a long memory. Her name was Mrs. Hartley, and she had taken one look at the thin, silent young woman delivered to her door like an inconvenient parcel, and decided 2 things. The first was that the girl was no more consumptive than the kitchen cat. The second was that there was a wrong here, and Mrs. Hartley had spent 30 years married to a man who undid wrongs for a living, and she had not forgotten how it was done. So while the county buried Eleanor in advance, Eleanor was learning. She read her late husband's uncle's affairs by candlelight at Mrs. Sess. Hartley's kitchen table, the marriage settlements, the terms of the entail, the old lord's will copied out in a clerk's careful hand. She learned what land was tied to the title, and what was not. She learned that the manor of Renfield itself, the house and the home farm and the river meadows, had never been part of the entail at all. The old lord had bought it outright, with his own money, late in life, meaning it for a favorite. And she learned, from a single line in a settlement no one had read carefully in years, the thing that changed everything. She did not tell Hugh. She told no one but Mrs. Hartley. She waited, and she got well, and she watched the announcement of his second marriage appear in the papers as though she did not exist, and she made her plans the way a careful woman makes a fire, one small piece of kindling at a time, until the thing will catch. Now, the bells had stopped. The congregation was rising. And Eleanor Vane, who in the eyes of the law was still Lady Ashcombe, and would remain so until something a great deal stronger than a rumor said otherwise, turned and walked back down the lane to the inn, where she had taken a room under the name of her grandmother. The man waiting for her there was not Hugh. He was a tall man of perhaps 32, dark-haired, with the still bearing of someone who had learned early that authority is quieter than noise. He wore a plain dark coat without ornament, and he rose when she entered with a courtesy that had nothing performed in it. This was Mr. Thomas Calder, and he was the reason the line in the settlement mattered. He had been the old Lord Ashcombe's man of business for the last 6 years of the old man's life, the only person the old lord had trusted entirely, and he was the executor named in the will, that Hugh had never read past the first page. Eleanor had written to him in the spring. He had answered every letter. He had ridden 2 days to be in this town today, and he had brought the documents. "It is done, then," she said, drawing off her gloves. "He is married at noon." Calder said, his voice was low and level, the words placed rather than spilled, before half the county. "He could not have arranged better witnesses to what he has done if I had asked him to." She looked at him then, properly, for the first time since entering. There was something in the way he said it, a dryness underneath a gravity, that she had not expected and did not quite know how to hold. She had built him in her mind over the winter as a set of useful facts: executor, lawyer, ally, tix-tax. She had not built him as a man who might be standing in a low-ceilinged inn parlor, looking at her as though she were the only solid thing in a room full of smoke. "You are certain of the law," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am certain of the will," he answered, "which is better than the law, because the law can be argued and the will cannot. The old lord left Renfield to you, Lady Ashcombe." "Not to Hugh." "To you, by name, in a codicil he made 11 days before he died, after he learned how his nephew meant to treat the woman he had married. He did not approve of his nephew. He told me so, in language I will not repeat in a parlor. He left the title where the law compelled him to leave it. The house, the home farm, the meadows, every acre, he had bought with his own hand, he left to you because he said, a man who would throw away a good wife did not deserve a good house." Eleanor stood very still. Outside a cart went by, and a dog barked, and the ordinary afternoon went on as though the floor of her world had not just shifted under her feet. "He never met me," she said at last. "He met your letters," said Mr. Calder. "Your husband used to read them aloud, the early ones, when he still found you charming. The old lord remembered them. He said you wrote like a person who told the truth, even when it cost you something. He had not met many of those." A pause. "Neither. Till lately had I," she turned away to the window so he would not see what his words had done to her face. The body has its own honesty, and hers had never learned to lie as well as her face had. She felt the warmth climb her throat, and was angry at it, because warmth was a thing she could not afford. Not today. Not from a man whose usefulness she needed, and whose kindness she did not know how to bank. "Then we go this afternoon," she said to the glass. "This afternoon?" he agreed. "While the wine is still being poured and his guests are still in the house to see it. The law moves slowly, Lady Ashcombe, but possession does not. If you are standing in your own hall when the truth is read, no court in England will easily put you out of it again." She had thought she would feel triumph. Standing in that parlor, she found instead that she felt the old grief sharpened to a point, because the man she was about to unmake had once held her hands in this very town and promised her things, and a part of her that she despised was sorry it had come to this. She did not say so. She put her gloves back on. The wedding breakfast at Renfield had reached the hour when the speeches are done, and the company has begun to drift into smaller, warmer knots, and the new Lady Ashcombe was being admired in the long gallery beneath the portraits of men who would not have admired her. Her name had been Sophie Pennington a week ago. She was 19, golden, and entirely innocent of what had been done to make room for her, which was a thing Eleanor would later make herself remember, when remembering it cost her. because the girl was not the wrong. The girl was only the place where the wrong had come to rest. Hugh, Lord Ashcombe, stood at the head of the gallery with a glass in his hand, and the particular ease of a man who has arranged the world to his satisfaction. He had grown handsomer with rank, as some men do, the soldier's lean hunger smoothed into something fed and certain. When the footman came to murmur that there was a lady at the door who would not give her name but said his lordship would know her, he did not even set down his glass. He assumed it was a tenant, or a charity, or one of the small annoyances that attach themselves to a great day. He went out to the hall to dismiss it quickly. He found his first wife standing on the black and white marble beneath the great stair, with a dark man in a plain coat beside her holding a leather case, and the color went out of his face the way water goes out of a cracked jug. All at once, and from the bottom. "Eleanor," he said. "Just that?" "Lord Ashcombe," she answered. She had decided over many cold nights that she would not call him Hugh. The name belongs to a girl who no longer lived in her. Behind him, drawn by the silence that has its own carrying power in a full house, the guests had begun to gather at the gallery's end and along the upper landing. Sophie appeared at the top of the stair in her wedding silk, her small hand on the balustrade, looking down at the tableau below without yet understanding it. The dowager who had engineered the match, Hugh's aunt by marriage, the formidable Lady Brandon, came to the gallery door and took in the scene with the instant cold arithmetic of a woman who has spent her life counting threats. "This woman," Lady Brandon said, pitching her voice to Carrie to make it a public thing and therefore a manageable one, "is an impostor. Lady Ashcombe died in the north this spring. We had the letter. She had not had the letter. She had had a silence, and built a death out of it, because the death was convenient. Someone fetch the magistrate. The poor creature is plainly deranged." There it was again. The verdict the county had passed in advance, spoken now in a great hall by a woman who needed it to be true. Poor creature. Deranged, a thing to be removed. Eleanor felt the old urge to shrink, to apologize for the inconvenience of her own continued existence, and she did not obey it. She had Mrs. Hartley's voice in her ear from 100 kitchen evenings. "They will tell you what you are. You will know better. Stand where you are and let the paper speak." Mr. Calder stepped forward one pace. He did not raise his voice. In a room straining to hear, he had no need to. "My name is Thomas Calder. I was the late Lord Ashcombe's man of business, and I am the executor of his estate. This lady is Eleanor Lady Ashcombe, lawful wife of the late Lord's nephew, and very much alive, as a great many of you can plainly see." He opened the case. "I hold here the old Lord's will, proved and sealed, and a codicil in his own hand. I would ask his lordship whether he has ever read either to the end." Hugh said nothing. The answer was in his face, and Mr. Galt, Calder, who read men the way he read documents, did not need him to speak it. "I thought not," he said, still without heat. "Then I will read the part that concerns this house." Eleanor would remember the next minutes for the rest of her life, not for the triumph of them which she had expected, but for their terrible quiet. "Mr. Tominett," Calder read in a clerk's flat cadence which was somehow worse for the company than any thunder, the words of a dead man who had seen exactly what his nephew was and had quietly built a door the nephew could not lock. The manor of Renfield, the home farm, the river meadows, the orchards and the cottages on them, all that the old lord had purchased outside the entail, devised entire and without condition to Eleanor, Lady Ashcombe, in recognition, the codicil said, of her constancy, and in correction of a wrong he had not the years left to right himself. When he finished, there was a silence you could have walked across. Sophie, on the stair, had gone white. Lady Brandon had gone very still, her fan halfway to her face, and forgotten there. And Hugh, Lord Ashcombe, master of Renfield, until 11 words of a dead man's hand unmade him, looked at the woman he had buried alive in the north and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had never once, in 3 years, troubled to find out what she was. "You may keep the title," Eleanor said into the quiet. Her voice did not shake, and she was glad of it later, because it had wanted to. You may keep the name and the seat in the Lords and the bows in the street. I find I have no use for them. You are standing in my hall, however, and your guests are eating at my table. And by dusk, I should like my house to myself. It was not a speech. She had not planned the words. They came out of her the way water finds the lowest path, plainly, and they landed in that great gilded room with more weight than any speech could have carried, because everyone in it could hear that she meant exactly what she said, and not one syllable more. I will tell you now, because you have come this far with her, that this was the hinge of it, the noon and the dusk of the old saying made real in a single afternoon. The story does not end with a house won, though a house is only walls. What Eleanor did not yet know, standing there in borrowed strength, was that the harder thing was still ahead, and that the man with the leather case would be standing closer to its center than either of them intended. The guests left as guests leave a house where something has gone wrong, quickly, and with their eyes down and a great deal to say once they were past the gates. By 4 o'clock, the carriages were a memory of dust on the avenue. Lady Brandon left, last and least gracefully, pausing at the door to tell Eleanor in a low, vicious undertone that she would regret this, that a woman alone could not hold a house against a family, that there were ways. Eleanor heard her out. Then she said, mildly, that Mr. Calder would be very glad to discuss any ways Lady Brandon cared to attempt, in writing with witnesses. And Lady Brandon went out to her carriage with her spine very straight, and her plans for the moment in disarray. Hugh did not leave. There was the matter of where he was to go, and the larger matter of Sophie, who had married a baron at noon, and discovered by dusk that her husband owned a title and very little else, the income of Renfield having gone where the house had gone. The girl sat in the morning room with her wedding silk crushed about her, and wept, not prettily, the way the very young weep when the world has lied to them for the first time. Eleanor, who might have left her to it, did not. She sent for tea, and she sat with her, and she said, the only true and useful thing she had, none of this was your doing. You were told a story, as I was once told a story. The difference is that yours unraveled in a single afternoon, and mine took 3 years. She poured. Drink that. You are not ruined. You are married to a man with a great name, and you are 19. And the world is kinder to a young wife than it ever was to a discarded one. Only do not let him tell you what you are. That is the one thing I would say to any woman in this house. They will tell you what you are. No better. Sophie looked at her over the rim of the cup, as though Eleanor were a creature out of a story. The wronged wife who turns out to be the one with the deeds, and something in the girl's face shifted from terror toward the beginning of a hard new understanding. It was not friendship. It was too soon and too strange for that. It was, however, the end of the lie that Eleanor had been a monster, and that was enough for one afternoon. When the house was finally quiet, when the last of the breakfast had been cleared by servants who did not yet know whom they served and were watching Eleanor, with the wariness of people deciding which way the wind has turned, she found Mr. Comper. Mr. Calder in the library. He had built a small fire against the evening chill, and was standing before it with the leather case closed on the table, as though his work were done and he did not quite know how to leave. You should rest, he said when she came in. You have not sat down since noon. Neither have you. I am paid to stand about. The dry note again, underneath. You are not paid for any of this. You did the harder part. I only read aloud. She came to the fire. The day was draining out of her now that there was no one left to be strong in front of, and the library was warm, and he was a steady dark shape between her and the cold glass, and she was so tired of being alone with the weight of her own resolve that she let herself for one moment simply stand near another human being who wished her well. "Why did you answer my letters?" she asked the fire. "The first one. You did not know me. You could have sent it to a clerk. You could have ignored it. A great many men would have, rather than make an enemy of a baron." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had lost the dryness. Because I had read the codicil 3 years ago, he said, and I had said nothing, and I had let it sit in a locked drawer while a man I had served carried out exactly the wrong his uncle tried to prevent. I told myself it was not my place. I told myself the old lord was dead and the living must be managed. I told myself a great many comfortable things. He looked at the fire, and not at her. And every quarter when I sent your allowance to the north, that small insulting allowance, I added it up, and knew what it was and did nothing. Your first letter came in March. It was 3 lines long. It did not beg. It asked me, as one honest person to another, whether I knew anything of the old lord's true wishes regarding his nephew's wife. I had been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question plainly. I answered it because I could not bear to be the kind of man who would not. This was his wound, laid out flat in the firelight, and Eleanor recognized it, because she had carried its twin. He had been complicit in her burial, and the guilt of it had sat in him for 3 years like a stone in a shoe, and he had crossed 2 days of country, and made an enemy of an influential family not to win her anything but to set down the stone. She found she could not be angry at the silence. He confessed she had spent 3 years learning how heavy silence is to break, and how much easier it is to keep. You could have set it down by simply sending me the codicil, she said. You did not need to come. No, he agreed. I did not need to come. He left it there, and the leaving of it there said everything the coming had said, and Eleanor felt the warmth in her throat again, and this time did not fight it. The fire settled. Somewhere above them a clock struck the half-hour. They stood a little apart, in the way of 2 people who have each spent years being careful, and neither closed the small distance, and the not closing of it was charged in a way that no closing could have been. He was aware of her. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he did not quite turn to her, and did not quite turn away. And she was aware of him, of the exact place where he stood, of the steadiness that had answered every letter, and she understood with a quiet shock that somewhere in the long correspondence of that winter she had begun to want, not the house, not the vindication, but this. The plain man before the fire who had crossed 2 days of road to set down a stone. It would not be proper, she said, to the thing neither of them had said aloud, for you to remain in the house tonight. No, he said, it would not. And he reached then, not for her but for his case, to take it up and go, and his hand stopped halfway. Hovering because going was the proper thing, and he found plainly that he did not want to do it. The reach and the stopping of it were more honest than any word. Eleanor looked at the hand that had hovered, and then at his face, and she did him the kindness she had not been done. Then you will return tomorrow, she said. There is a great deal of business to settle. An estate does not run itself. I shall need a man of business who tells the truth, even when it costs him something. I am told they are rare. He looked at her, and the gravity of his face broke for just an instant into something that was almost, very nearly a smile, and she understood that she had seen something he did not show to many. You are told correctly, he said. He took up the case. At the door he turned. Good night. Lady Ashcombe. Good night. Mr. Calder? He went out into the dusk, and she stood in the library of the house that was hers, and for the first time since the bells had rung that morning, she let herself feel the whole size of the day at once. It was too large to feel quickly. It would take weeks, she thought, to understand that she did not have to leave, that no carriage was coming for her, that the damp house on the moors and the small insulting allowance and the kindly murmured death were all behind her now. She put her hand flat on the cold window glass and looked out at the avenue where the wedding carriages had stood, and felt the strangeness of belonging somewhere settle over her like a coat she was not yet used to wearing. The weeks that followed were the slow, ordinary, astonishing work of taking up a life one had been told one was not permitted to have. Eleanor learned the house the way she had learned the will, room by room and account by account. She found the servants frightened of nothing so much as not knowing who they served, and she ended their fright by the simple method of knowing their names. All of them, the under gardener and the boot boy, as well as the butler, and by asking the housekeeper, Mrs. Penhallow, what had always been done, and then deciding, in conversation rather than command, what would be done now. The household, which had braced for a tyrant or a fool, found instead a woman who had spent 3 years in a kitchen learning what work cost, and who could not be made to forget it. Hugh came back once in the second week without Sophie to make the case that some accommodation might be reached. He found Eleanor in the estate office with the ledgers open and Mr. Comberley Calder at the other desk, and he had the grace, or the calculation, to be civil. He proposed that she allow him the use of the home farm for the look of the thing, so that the county should not say Lord Ashcombe had been turned out of his own land like a debtor. The county will say what it likes, Eleanor told him. It said I was dying for 3 years and was wrong. I no longer arrange my life around what the county will say, and I find the freedom of it considerable. She closed the ledger. You have your title and your young wife, and your seat in the Lords. You have the things you chose when you chose them over me. I will not begrudge you those. You sent me north to die quietly, Hugh, and the north did not oblige you. And I will not now hand you back in friendship the very land your uncle took the trouble to keep from your hands. Go home to Sophie. Be a better husband to her than you were to me. That is the only accommodation I will help you reach. He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he had meant to say he did not say, and he made her a small, stiff bow that was, she realized afterward, the first time in their entire acquaintance that he had treated her as a person whose answer mattered. Then he went, and he did not come back to argue again. Ward reached her later by the slow underground post of servants and tradesmen that he had taken Sophie to his townhouse and was, by all accounts, attempting in his clumsy way to be the thing Eleanor had told him to be. She did not know whether to believe it. She found she did not need to. Lady Brandon made one further attempt. A letter came from a London attorney, full of long words and longer threats, suggesting that the codicil might be contested, that a dead man's hand was a frail thing to hang an estate upon, that a sensible woman would settle rather than face the expense of law. Eleanor took it to Mr. Calder, who read it through once, and then a second time more, slowly, and then laid it down with the nearest thing to contempt she had seen in him. There is nothing here, he said. It is a letter written to frighten a woman who is presumed to be alone and ignorant. You are neither. He drew a fresh sheet toward him. With your leave, I will answer it in a way that ends the correspondence. And he did, in 3 cold paragraphs of fact, citing the proving of the will, and the witnesses to the codicil, and the precise legal nothing of Lady Brandon's position, and the London attorney, who had written hoping for a frightened settlement, read the names of the witnesses and the date of the proving, and advised his client to let the matter drop. Lady Brandon let it drop. She had spent her life winning by the confidence of her own voice, and she had met, at last, a quiet that her confidence could not move. Through all of it, Mr. Calder came each morning and went each dusk, and the impropriety of his presence was managed by the great deal of genuine business there was to do, and by Mrs. Penhallow's tactful arrangement of an elderly cousin of her own as a sort of companion to Eleanor, so that the house should be above remark. Business, however genuine, has its limits as a disguise. And there came a morning in the 4th week when the ledgers were balanced and the harvest was in, and the threats were ended, and there was suddenly no urgent reason for Mr. Calder to be sitting at the second desk in the estate office at all. They both became aware of it at the same moment. He had finished totaling a column and set down his pen, and the silence afterward had nothing in it to fill, and Eleanor understood that the scaffolding of necessity that had let them be in a room together every day for a month had just been quietly taken down. The accounts are in good order, he said. You scarcely need me to keep them. You keep better books than I do. He was looking at the pen, and nodded her. I have been thinking that I ought to put forward a steward, a reliable man, so that you are not dependent on my coming and going, which the county, as you say, will eventually find something to say about. It was a generous offer, and a careful one, And it was also, Eleanor understood, a door he was holding open for her so that she could send him away without unkindness, if sending him away was what she wished. He had spent the whole month being a man who set down stones and held open doors. See. She thought of the small insulting allowance and the damp house and the kindly murmured death, and the 3 years in which not one person who had wronged her had ever once given her a choice in anything, and she found that she did not want to be careful any longer. "Mr. Calder," she said. "Thomas." It was the first time she had used his given name, and it landed in the quiet room the way his reading of the codicil had landed in the great hall, a small plain fact that changed the weather. He looked up. "I do not want a reliable man at the second desk. I want the man who is already sitting at it. I have been told my whole life what I am and what I am permitted to want, and I have just spent a month discovering that the people who told me were wrong about all of it. So I will tell you plainly, since you crossed 2 days of road to be plain with me, I would rather you did not go." He sat very still. The morning light was on his face, and she watched him understand her, and watched the careful executor and the quiet man of business set themselves down at last like the case he had carried into her hall. "I have nothing to offer you that you do not already own," he said. "No title, no estate. The house is yours, the land is yours. I would come to you with my profession and my name and nothing else." "I have had a title," Eleanor said. "It was attached to a man who buried me alive. I find I value other things now. I value a man who could have sent me a document, and instead rode 2 days to set down a stone. I value being told the truth when it costs the teller something. I have had luxury without those things, and I had rather have those things without luxury. Though, as it happens," and here the dry note crept into her own voice, surprising her, "an inheritance from him, as it happens I shall have both, and so will you, and I cannot see that either of us need apologize for it." The smile broke fully across his grave face, then the one she had glimpsed in the firelight on the first night, and he rose and came around the desk, and he did not seize her, or speak a speech, because he was not a man of seizing or speeches. He stopped a careful pace from her, the way he always stopped, and he lifted her hand, the right one, the one that had closed around the strap of the reticule in the churchyard a month ago, when she had stood outside her own life and listened to it being given away, and he held it in both of his as though it were the deed to something. And he bent and pressed his mouth to the back of her glove, and then after a breath to the bare skin of her wrist above it, where her pulse was going on with its steady, stubborn work of being alive. She felt it there, his mouth at her wrist, and the whole long winter of careful letters and the whole long day of careful triumph gave way at once to something that was not careful at all. "I should warn you," he murmured against her wrist, "that I am a poor match. My mother kept a school, my father mended clocks. I have made my own way, and it has not made me Grand Thomas." She said, "Be quiet." And he was. And for a moment, in the estate office of the house that a dead man had given her in correction of a wrong, two people who had each spent years being careful stopped being careful, and the morning held its breath around them, and neither one moved to break the holding. They were married in the spring, in the small church of St. Aldhelm, where she had married the first time, in a wedding far smaller than the one Hugh had thrown at noon, and far warmer. Mrs. Hartley came down from the north, sharp-eyed and triumphant, and wept through the whole of it and pretended afterward that she had not. Mrs. Penhallow's elderly cousin gave Eleanor away. Sophie sent a letter, a real one, 3 pages of it, saying that she was learning to manage her own husband's small economies, and that she thought of Eleanor's words to her in the morning room more often than she could say, and that she hoped, very much, that they might be something like friends when enough time had passed. Eleanor kept the letter. She had learned the worth of letters that told the truth. She did not take a new title. She remained, by the strangeness of the law, Lady Ashcombe, widow in name to a living man's lost first marriage, and she found she did not mind it, because the name no longer meant the thing it had meant. It meant only that she had survived a man who tried to bury her. She signed the estate papers, Eleanor Calder, where the law allowed it, and let the rest stand. And Thomas, who understood her better than anyone living, never once suggested she ought to feel otherwise. On a morning the following autumn, a year almost to the day from the wedding at noon, and the dusk that undid it, Eleanor stood at the library window of Renfield with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, and watched her husband walk up from the home farm in the soft gold light, his coat plain as ever, stopping to speak to the under-gardener whose name he had taken the trouble to learn. The river meadows lay green beyond him. The orchards the old lord had bought with his own hand were heavy with fruit. No one would now sell out from under her. On the sill beside her lay the letter folded 3 times that she had carried in her reticule into the churchyard a year before, the one that had said she had every reason to come. She had kept it. She kept it still. She did not need it any longer, but she had learned that a person should hold on to the plain, true thing that gave her the courage to stand where she was when the whole county told her to go. She put down the cup. She put her hand flat on the cold glass, as she had done on the first night, and this time the strangeness had worn away and left only the warmth beneath it, the settled, unhurried warmth of belonging somewhere at last. Below her Thomas looked up at the window and saw her there, and lifted his hand, and the gravity of his face broke into the smile he kept for her alone. She lifted hers in answer. The tea went cold, and neither of them minded, and the morning went on around the two of them, gold and unremarkable, and entirely their own. If Eleanor's long winter and her single afternoon moved you, I hope you will stay a while with the people in your own life who told you the truth when it cost them something, and let the others say what they like. Thank you for staying with her to the end.